No doubt you've discovered that loyalty is no longer the currency of the realm, as your father believes.
Then what is?
I'm afraid currency is the currency of the realm.
Across the Spanish Main. Part 7. Treachery at San Juan de Ulua. On August 12, 1568, as John Hawkins's fleet of 8 ships approached the Florida coast, a terrible gale roared out of the east. For 4 days it tore at the ships, causing leaks, damaging rudders, and breaking rigging. Hawkins signaled to his squadron to turn around and run before the wind. One vessel, the tiny William and John, apparently missed that signal, struggled on, and eventually made a miraculous passage back to England with about 50 men. The rest were swept along like spindrift by the howling winds and awful seas until they found themselves in the shallows off Florida's west coast. For 2 days, Hawkins poked along the coast, searching for a place where he could careen and repair the Jesus. But the inshore waters all shelved too gradually for the 700-ton flagship to reach a beach. In desperation, Hawkins turned seaward again, only to encounter a second frightful gale. This one was from the north and battered the ships for 3 additional days, and when it had mercifully abated, the fleet had been blown across to the Triangles, a group of islets off Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. Hawkins was now in waters where no English ship had ever ventured, and the Jesus was more in need of repair than ever. On September 11th, in the Bay of Campeche, Hawkins stopped a Spanish merchant ship, not for loot, but simply for information. Her captain informed him that the only nearby harbor that was well protected from the season's northerly gales was at the small island of San Juan de Ulua, 15 miles south of Veracruz. But Hawkins also learned that the heavily armed Spanish flota, the Treasure Fleet, would make its annual call at San Juan at the end of September. At best, the English could count only on 10 to 12 days in which to make repairs and be gone. Hawkins turned southwest and late in the evening on September 15th raised the rocky island. The following morning his 7 ships approached San Juan in single file, with the stricken but still imposing Jesus in the lead. Nearing the harbor, Hawkins passed orders to fly the English royal standard on the main topmast of the Jesus and on the foretopmast of the second-in-line Minion. Ashore, seeing the ships but not the flags, Francisco de Bustamante, the lieutenant treasurer of Veracruz, scrambled out with a crew to meet the vessels. Bustamante was rehearsing an effusive speech of welcome, for he thought, as did every other Spaniard on the island, that the ships were long-awaited flota. The Spaniards did not realize their mistake until the last minute. The flags of Hawkins's ships were so faded because of the storms that they were never perceived by the Spaniards. Bustamante and his crew found themselves staring into English pistols, and Hawkins ordered them aboard the Jesus before any alarm could be given. On San Juan de Ulua, the commander of the Spanish garrison, Juan Antonio Delgadillo, also mistook Hawkins's ship for the flota and ordered a welcoming salute of 5 unshotted cannon. Hawkins carefully replied and ranged his ships around the harbor, preparing to anchor. Only then did Delgadillo realize his error, but it was too late. The English were in position to wipe out the town with their cannon. Delgadillo tried to rally his forces, ordering them to load their cannon and fire, but in panic they piled into small boats and fled to the mainland. Thus Hawkins had gained command of the port the Admiral Pedro Menendez de Aviles, when surveying the Maine's defenses only a few years before, had confidently regarded as beyond the reach of any foreign sail. But Hawkins at this stage still did not think of himself as an enemy. He sent a messenger to find Delgadillo, to assure him that the English intentions were peaceful, and to make arrangements to repair and reprovision the Jesus. Hawkins even managed to suppress his traitor's instincts in the interest of maintaining peace. All this while he had been carrying with the surviving slaves in his hold, but he apparently did not attempt to sell them at San Juan de Ulua. Unfortunately for Hawkins, at that very moment the 13 ships of the Spanish flota were less than a day's sail from the Mexican coast. On the flagship was Don Martin Enriquez de Almanza. Enriquez undoubtedly knew Hawkins was in the Caribbean, but, like Menendez, did not dream of an interloper so far west, so deep in the Spanish New World Empire. His thoughts were on the voyage, now nearly over. Enriquez was sailing as the honored passenger of Francisco de Lujan, Captain General of the flota. Lujan's flagship led a convoy of 11 merchantmen, heavily laden with wine, cloth, and manufactured goods for New Spain, and meant to freight the year's accumulation of treasure back to Europe. Bringing up the rear was a second Spanish man of war under the command of Admiral Juan de Ubilla. The viceroy-designate Enriquez held no official appointment at sea, only the privileges of an honored passenger, but among his papers he carried a royal commission vesting him supreme command should he find cause to exercise it. That cause came at San Juan de Ulua the next day, on September 17th, when Port Commander Delgadillo clambered aboard Lujan's flagship, breathlessly bearing the news of Hawkins's arrival. The Englishman, Delgadillo said, had declared his peaceful intentions and promised to clear the port as soon as his ships were seaworthy. Hawkins proposed that while the Jesus was being repaired, each side should put up 12 gentlemen as hostages for maintenance of peace. Finally, intent as always on selling his cargo, Hawkins requested a license to sell as much wares as he might to furnish their wants. Upon receiving Hawkins's message, Enriquez assumed immediate command and issued a call to council. Lujan, Ubilla, and other captains of the Spanish fleet gathered on the flagship. Enriquez was enraged at Hawkins' effrontery. He proposed to the Spanish commanders that they instantly attack the Englishmen. Unlike the provincial officials on the Main, whom Hawkins had so easily bent to his will, Enriquez, as Viceroy of New Spain, had no intention of compromising with the hated English. But the naval commanders pointed out to the Viceroy that the flota could not enter by force so long as the invaders held the island batteries at the harbor's entrance. Yet it was also true that to remain outside of the harbor was to risk shipwreck in the event of a storm. A council of captains persuaded Enriquez to go along with Hawkins's truce, at least initially, and to exchange hostages, only reducing the number from 12 to 10. The next morning, September 18th, the nobleman Enriquez wrote to the merchant Hawkins and agreed to accept the proposal that your honor makes, asking me to deliver hostages and to enter the port in peace. But, behind those peaceful words, he definitely had plans to destroy this infuriating English interloper. No sooner had the Council of War adjourned the night before than Enriquez dispatched an appeal to the nearby city of Veracruz, requesting as many troops as were available. The city had responded with 150 soldiers who arrived that same night, raising the Spaniards' fighting strength to more than 1,000 men. And now, as he prepared for the exchange of gentlemen hostages, Enriquez even contemplated dressing up certain able seamen and certain soldiers attired to look like their betters. But he was dissuaded by Admiral Ubilla, who pointed out that common soldiers, knowing their lives were likely to be forfeit, might give the attack plans away. From his own ship, Ubilla grandly offered his color-bearer, 2 squad masters, and his own nephew. He would go himself, he said, but he realized that his services would be of more value to the flota. Meanwhile, on San Juan, Hawkins prudently gave orders to man the small fortress guarding the harbor. His men took a number of cannon from the smaller ships in his squadron and mounted them alongside the 16 Spanish pieces already in position. Then, according to a prisoner on board the Jesus, the English removed most of their men from the smaller ships and transferred them to the flagship, which vessel anchored at the harbor they prepared to clear for action. For 3 days following Enriquez's arrival, a southwest wind kept the flota anchored in the roadstead. But on September 21st, the winds backed to the east and the Spanish entered the harbor. By Hawkins's account, the sailors from both fleets labored 2 days, placing the English ships by themselves and the Spanish by themselves, the captains for each part promising great amity on all sides. The 2 fleets, totaling 20 ships, were now anchored side by side, close under the lee of the small island, their bowsprits actually overhanging the land. The guns in the fort, each manned by a crew of Englishmen, had been trundled around until they now covered the Spaniards at point-blank range. It was time for Enriquez to call a second council of his commanders. The viceroy proposed that in the night Admirals Lujan and Ubilla, with 150 hand-picked men, secretly board a large Spanish merchantman that was moored in the harbor extremely close to the Minion and the Jesus. At a trumpet signal from the flota's flagship, the Spanish would haul the vessel alongside the Minion and board the Englishmen. To capture the island guns, Enriquez directed that the 150 soldiers from Veracruz be hidden below decks on a number of Spanish ships anchored close to the shore. At the same signal, they would then scramble out along the overhanging bowsprit, drop to the ground, and race to assault the fort. The remaining Spaniards would attack the English ships once the battle had begun. The time of the assault was set for noon the next day, September 23rd. Early that morning, Hawkins noted that the Spaniards were busily engaged in shifting of weapons from ship to ship. Hawkins sent Robert Barrett, master of the Jesus, who was fluent in Spanish, to inquire on the viceroy. Barrett returned with word from Enriquez that no villainies would occur, but the Spanish preparations went on, and Hawkins sent Barrett a second time to seek further reassurances. The time was 10 o'clock, and as Hawkins sat down for a hasty meal, one of the Spanish hostages drew a dagger from his sleeve and tried to stab the English captain. An aide overpowered the assailant, and all appetite lost, Hawkins returned to the deck. Looking across the cargo hulk, he now recognized Admiral Ulua standing on the vessel and shouted across, accusing the officer of treachery. When the Spaniard cried back that he was simply doing his duty, Hawkins picked up a bow and shot an arrow at Ulua. He missed, and at that instant Ulua signaled Enriquez. Aboard the flota's flagship, the Spanish viceroy was assuring Barrett of his innocence. But he now dropped the mask, had Barrett clapped in irons, and ordered the trumpet signal for the attack to begin. Screaming, "Santiago!" Ulua and his men boarded the Minion. But before the Spanish could gain control of the ship, Hawkins and some of his men from the nearby Jesus leaped aboard the Minion to counterattack. One English sailor recalled that Hawkins, with a loud and fierce voice, called unto us, saying, "God and St. George, upon those traitorous villains, and rescue the Minion. I trust in God the day shall be ours." Firing their pistols, splashing and thrusting with their cutlasses and pikes, Hawkins and his men swept the Spaniards from the Minion. Then 3 other Spanish ships slipped up to grapple with the Jesus in a second attack, which Hawkins also beat back. But it was obvious, with other Spaniards in the harbor joining the fray, that the English were outnumbered and in real danger. Hawkins ordered the moorings of the Minion and the Jesus cut in an attempt to clear away from the melee. While the battle raged on board the ships, the Spanish land assault, led by Delgadillo, overwhelmed the Englishmen defending the island battery. At the sound of the viceroy's trumpet, Spanish soldiers came out of hiding and charged the guns. "Our men ashore," Hawkins lamented bitterly, being stricken with sudden fear, gave place, fled, and sought to recover succor of the ships. Only 3 of the island's defenders survived. The rest, Hawkins reported, were massacred without mercy. With the island fort now in their possession, the Spaniards commenced a fierce bombardment of the drifting Jesus and Minion. But by now the 2 English ships had been carried to within point-blank range of the anchored Spanish flota. Ignoring the damaging fire from the fort, they blasted the Spanish vessels with broadside after broadside, sinking the Viceroy's flagship, which came to rest upright in the harbor mud, and setting another ship on fire. The English vessels had also been very badly cut up. One Englishman saw that the Jesus had 5 shots through her main mast. Her foremast was struck asunder with chain shot, and her hull was wonderfully pierced with shot. The Minion was battered but serviceable. However, the other English ships had fared terribly. The Angel was sunk, the Swallow and the Portuguese caravel were captured, and the remaining French ship was abandoned in flames by her crew. Only the Judith, originally moored farthest from the melee, got clear undamaged, and anchored at a distance, where her captain, Drake, was helpless to effect the outcome. Hawkins, at last convinced that there was no hope to carry the Jesus away, positioned his doomed flagship as a shield between the island battery and the Minion, so as to transfer to her. The stratagem appeared to work, until Ulua rigged 2 fire ships to float down on the English. Hawkins, who had been directing the loading of goods and provisions from the Jesus, was one of the last to leap off the ship before the Minion drew clear. She had 200 men on board. The only other English survivors were some 30 men on the Judith. The other 100 men in Hawkins' force were either dead or Spanish prisoners doomed to years in the dungeons. Some, including Robert Barrett, were put to death by their captors. The battle had raged for more than 6 hours. At dusk, the Minion and the Judith anchored just beyond the harbor for the night, out of range of the shore guns and precisely where the Spanish flota had lain 6 days before. That night, to Hawkins' utter surprise, Drake made good his escape, heading for England. Hawkins, bitter that Drake forsook us in our misery, remained at anchor and took stock of his predicament. Naturally, he had left his remaining slaves on board the abandoned Jesus. Some of them had been there for 9 months, as well as the Spanish hostages. He had managed to transfer the bulk of his gold and silver, about 13,000 pounds worth, to the Minion, but the Englishmen had taken little else. In the rush to escape, Hawkins' men had managed to bring few provisions from the Jesus. All the next day, September 24th, the Minion was pinned down on the Mexican coast by a heavy north wind, in grave danger of dragging her anchor and being driven aground. But the following day, to Hawkins' vast relief, the weather waxed reasonable and they were able to set sail. As the battered Minion beat eastward, the English were reduced to stewing ox hides from the ship's cargo. This diet was hardly enough to sustain the labor of keeping the leaking vessel afloat, and on October 8th, the Minion put into the Mexican coast, where 100 men elected to remain ashore rather than starve on the Minion. Some of those left behind would survive years of hardships imposed by the Spaniards, Indians, and the hostile land, but most would succumb quickly to the rigors that faced them ashore. The Minion staggered across the Atlantic. The majority of her 100 men or so died long before Hawkins reached the coast of Cornwall on January 25, 1569. Those who managed to survive were so weak that, according to Hawkins, we scantily were able to manage our own ship. Hawkins did not record exactly how many men made it home aboard the Minion, but a Spanish agent in England reported to Madrid that the number was no more than 15. Considering all vessels lost, the profit from his voyage was negligible. A Spanish agent informed his monarch that Hawkins had come from the West Indies with 4 horse loads of gold and silver, which, however, I will believe will not pay the costs. The consequences of the expedition, however, were considerably greater than the profits. For the first time, Spaniards and Englishmen had fought a pitched battle on the Main. The Spaniards had won this initial encounter, but the voyage and Hawkins's earlier ones had exposed the Spanish Main in all its vulnerability. The Spaniards could not control their widespread empire effectively enough to keep it closed to an aggressive foreigner in search of wealth. That lesson did not escape Francis Drake, Hawkins's young cousin, and if Drake needed a reason, other than his keenly whetted appetite for gold, to justify his returning to the Main to plunder and wreak some havoc of his own making, he now had a ready excuse that he would offer freely to all who inquired in the years to come: his burning hatred of the Spanish for their treachery at San Juan de Ulua.